Hey, how's that North America video going? As mentioned in the past on a few live streams and small update videos on my second channel, I'm working on it. Although admittedly I've occasionally developed burnout from it and have taken multiple months off from working on it, so admittedly it hasn't been constant. I took breaks because I didn't want to just get frustrated and give up on it. I do want the project to be finished, and I certainly do not plan to give up on it. 2023 in particular was a year of correcting a lot of mistakes as well. On this project I've been working backwards from the present, basically because I found editing modern borders already on the map is easier than starting from a blank map in 3000 BC, especially when you work with MS Paint. Either way, I had completed it all the way back to the late 1600s, but I realized that I made many mistakes I needed to fix. Furthermore, as I kept learning more about Indigenous American history, I realized I needed to change how I make videos like these before I continue moving forward, backwards, to make things easier. So in this update video, I will not only discuss the mistakes I've worked on and fixed, but how I've changed my process working on this video and lessons I've learned about taking on big projects like this. Like I mentioned, some of this stuff will be things I've mentioned on some live streams or on smaller update videos I posted on my second channel, but not many people saw those. Not to mention, since I first announced I was working on this project back in August of 2020, my audience has grown by almost 50%, so that's a lot of people who might not even be aware of the project at all. To summarize, on August 19th, 2020, I excitedly announced that I was remaking my video that mapped out the history of North America. My old video from 2017 wasn't the worst, but it definitely needed a lot of improvement. For the new one, I wanted to fix mistakes, show a different projection that lets me zoom in more, and more importantly, I wanted to do a much better job mapping out indigenous groups. On my original video, I labeled some tribes, but not nearly all of the important ones. I also didn't spend the time to map out the migration and evolution of different indigenous tribes and societies north of Mexico. Like, I'm already cringing that on the original video I showed the Comanche existing in Texas in the 1500s, when not only were they not in Texas, but depending on who you ask, weren't even a distinct tribe yet. And while some tribes were nomadic groups, not all of them were, and I lazily labeled several tribes as nomadic when they were actually very developed nations not that different from European ones. So many maps and historical atlases and school textbooks make the same mistakes my original video did, and if the goal of history is to recount what happened, then historical maps should reflect that. So I set off to make an improved video, and as many of you have noticed, it's been over 3 years and it's still not finished, despite me being hilariously optimistic that, it'd only take a month or two. It turns out, complex societies are complex, and I realized that this is going to take much longer than I thought. One of the major events of North American history was the Beaver Wars. To sum it all up, the arrival of Europeans led to a higher demand of beaver pelts, and so it was economically and politically advantageous to control the supply of beaver pelts, and the Haudenosaunee, more commonly known as the Iroquois, were by that point a very militarily powerful force. So in the 17th century, they decided to basically beat up all of their neighbors from upstate New York all the way to the Great Lakes, setting up almost like a quasi-empire of sorts where they had first dibs on hunting grounds in the entire Ohio River Great Lakes area to monopolize their control on the beaver pelt trade, yada yada. And as you can imagine, many tribes didn't want to put up with that, so this caused a massive migration domino effect, where dozens of tribes that settled around the Great Lakes moved further west, driving those tribes further west, who drove other tribes further west and south, and so on, across the next 2 centuries or so. Many of the famous Great Plains tribes that have a huge part of the American frontier history, like the Lakota, the Kiowa, or the Cheyenne, were originally around the Great Lakes in the 17th century when the Pilgrims had barely arrived. It's basically North America's equivalent of what happened when the Huns arrived in Europe, causing all the Germanic tribes to move around. Now, imagine trying to keep track of that. But there are other issues that come with mapping indigenous American history. There is the old-fashioned saying that knowledge is power, and across indigenous American groups, each tribe has its own ideas on how to tell its history. Many tribes have a viewpoint that certain forms of knowledge, like cultural customs or their tribe's history, are sacred, and therefore kept secret from people outside of the tribe. But hey, it's just mapping their location and range on a map, not a total written history, so surely I could use European and American accounts for that, right? Yeah, in many cases I can. However, there are a few flaws to keep in mind. One, Europeans and Americans would erroneously group different tribes together as one, or maybe the opposite of erroneously not recognizing multiple bands as the same tribe, or some sort of other mistake, and so you kind of get conflicting or dubious information. Two, a lot of accounts from explorers like De Soto or Lewis and Clark are mere snapshots of what was going on at the time, and it's not like they were going through exploring every single year, so there are a lot of events that were just simply not known or recorded by the Europeans or Americans. And three, even if their accounts were perfect and full of a ton of detail, they would only be helpful from the 16th century onwards. So between faulty European accounts and restricted tribal histories, that just makes things harder. Then there are tribes where if you go to their official website, their official history is told through mythology and storytelling rather than a traditional chronological dating of specific events. And obviously, I'm not going to tell a culture how to preserve its history. That would be arrogant and stupid. And I love mythological history. But it does mean that as a result, there are dozens of tribes where when it comes to, like, say, making a timeline of their history, I can't. I kind of have to guess. And, like, it sucks, but what else can you really do? Most of what I've mentioned so far applies to indigenous history north of Mexico. What about Mesoamerican history? Luckily, that's a bit easier. There's a lot of detail about the Aztecs and Maya and other similar cultures, and thankfully, I'm in contact with a few experts on Mesoamerican history like Majora Z that can help me if I need it. So I'm not too worried, even if in some areas I have to simplify a little from the lack of details because conquistadors decided to be awful. There's also just the physical limitations of the map. There are dozens and dozens of city-states and tiny kingdoms, and yet only so many pixels I can draw borders and fit labels on. But the main issue of Mesoamerican history that I haven't even arrived at yet, but I am dreading, is figuring out how to handle the Toltecs. For those who don't know, for a while we believed that there was a medieval empire in the middle of Mexico called the Toltec Empire. Now we think it's more likely that the empire did not exist at all, and that the Aztec historiography it was based on was either flawed or mythological, or maybe a bit of both. So now I have to decide on how I'll map out 11th century Mexico when I get there. And ultimately, regardless of how I'll handle this, it's led me to this very sobering reality of not only will I not be able to make a perfect video, but some areas all I can do is guess, and I have to be okay with that, especially if I ever want to release a project. A lot of you are super supportive and probably understand this, but this is something that took me personally too long to accept. But now that I've explained some of the hurdles, let's go over how I've changed my approach to this project and what progress I've made across 2023. So, admittedly on many videos, I've been fine with researching as I go, in the sense that I'd get to a new year and go, okay, what happened this year? Look it up, map it out, repeat with the next year, keep a million tabs open on whatever sources I'm looking at to use when needed. And while this overall technically works, it's not the most efficient. It's easier to miss something, and also if there's a few years where suddenly a lot of stuff happens, it'll feel like you ran into an unexpected mess, and that could be draining. The obvious solution is to prepare ahead of time. Make some notes, make a timeline, and yeah, I've done that before, but I'd either make the timeline as I go along, which kind of defeats the purpose, or I would make a more basic one ahead of time and not a detailed one, and the finer details would be as I go. Once I realized I got to the 17th century with a lot of mistakes to fix, in early 2023 I realized the obvious. Hey dum-dum, maybe you should prepare stuff like timelines before you actually make the maps and make sure every important detail is on it so you don't miss it. Now, obviously, a comprehensive detailed timeline of all of North American geopolitical history is just as daunting as mapping it out. But at the very least, I can make timelines of the century I'm working on at the moment. It'll make things a lot easier, I can tell you that. I can type the important details, close a bunch of tabs, and more efficiently map things out with much fewer potential mistakes. Since I spent so much of 2023 fixing mistakes on the video, I'm still working on the timelines for the 1600s. And one of the things I also did as a sort of secondary rough draft timeline is make a document where I simply made a table for every tribe that I have labeled on the map and add a rough location marker of every 50 years from 1400 to 1700, just as a sort of rough draft general guide that'll help me researching for more details for a more comprehensive timeline of notes. All this is admittedly an annoying speed bump in making the video, but still an important step. And I know this will make it much easier, and I'm kicking myself for not doing it this way from the beginning. Insert some reference to hubris and Icarus flying too close to the sun. Now, in terms of the map mistakes I fixed, a lot of it was honestly label mistakes. There were some spots where I would label the same tribe differently on different parts of the map because I was referencing two different things, and each source used a different name. For example, I labeled a spot as Shoshone and another spot as the Niue tribe, and Niue is actually just another name for the Shoshone. Sometimes there'd be a case where I'd label a general cultural group of tribes under a single label, but then a tribe that's a part of that group was labeled separately for some reason. So I had to fix that as well. Then, of course, some tribes, as mentioned, migrated in the 1600s and 1700s, and I failed to map that, so I had to correct those. Across 2023, I basically fixed these mistakes one geographical region at a time. I was working on that tribe location rough draft document thingy at the same time, so first I researched and corrected mistakes for Alaskan area tribes, then Canadian Arctic ones, then Canadian prairie ones, and so on until I finished. This means that in terms of fixing mistakes on what I've done so far, I finally finished. In terms of making a timeline so I can continue deeper into the 1600s, I've got a bit more to do, but I'm almost there. It's hard to physically show everything I've had to fix, but as a small example, here's what I originally had as my North American slide for the year 1699 before I started fixing stuff. And here is what it is at the time of making this video. I know it's not a lot of progress that you can physically see, but I hope me explaining all of this adds context. Between changing how I go about my work, accepting my limitations, and so on, I not only feel better about working on this project, I'm not only more prepared to work on this project, but I'm also excited to work on this project in 2024, hopefully finishing it up. Once again, I am thankful not just for all of your support for my channel, but also your patience. Thanks for watching. I hope you all have a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. I'm Emperor Tiger Star, and I'll see you guys next time.